My guest on the podcast today is Brandon Maguire from the YouTube channel Daily Dose of Wisdom. Brandon's channel is absolutely flying at the moment, which I love to see because I've been following him for a few months now. And also, you guys may not know this, but he made a documentary called Mining for God. I'm going to leave that link in the bio. It's a fantastic documentary and an incredible distillation of the ideas of Christianity in an hour-long documentary. So I really hope you enjoy this. And with that, let's get into it. Cool. Okay, so Brandon Maguire, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I've been watching your channel a lot recently, and your channel is called A Daily Dose of Wisdom. Now, wisdom is a word that I love. Whenever I hear that word, it just has something about it. And it's not something that I typically associate with people who are young, like you and I, young men. But when I heard you speak, wisdom was one of the first things that actually came to mind. So what do you mean when you say the word wisdom?
I should first make a caveat that I don't pretend that the wisdom that's being delivered up is really primarily from myself. The channel, features a lot of other voices and a lot of other content, and the idea is really my idea is that I'm more so the mailman than anything else, where I'll maybe add a commentary here and there and integrate my perspective, my voice, but I'm also trying to curate and offer, conversations that I think are important and content that I think is important as well. But I love the word wisdom also. And I think that it's a powerful word, like you said. And I also like it because it isn't explicitly, it doesn't have a lot of baggage attached to it, like certain other Christian language does, where people immediately go, oh, I know what that is. I've heard that word before. So I like it in that I think it's a good word for my channel and what I'm trying to do, which is to actually have sort of interfaith dialogue and sort of cross aisle dialogue where we can actually, the idea is to allow thinking rather than just, again, label and dismiss. I'm familiar with that language. I'm familiar with, I think I know where this is going, swipe next. I'm trying to facilitate something that is a bit more, hopefully a bit more thoughtful than that.
And the reason why I enjoyed your channel was because it gave an insight into different video. Okay, obviously, I love debates. That's what I do with my channel is I break down debates for the most part. But I actually have never delved into the religious debates yet because firstly, people get really heated about it. And
Mm-hmm.
secondly, it's just too complicated for where I'm kind of at the moment, and where I'm at with my understanding about religion and these things. And you get this real imposter syndrome when you're talking about these issues. So I enjoyed hearing you talk about that. And then I found that you actually have a documentary, which I had no idea and even when I reached out to you, I had no idea that you had a documentary. And then
Yeah.
I watched the documentary, and it's funny because at that exact time, I was searching for something that would give me a comprehensive understanding of what of the fundamental ideas of religion, of obviously Christianity in your case.
Mm-hmm.
So finding that documentary was actually super cool, and I was incredibly impressed with the way that you were able to distill such complicated ideas within an hour. So tell me a little bit about the thought process behind creating that documentary and what was the goal?
I love that you said religion, well, then, and actually Christianity also, because that is also a reflection of what I've tried to do with that documentary, which is not to, again, necessarily begin with any assumptions about reality that are explicitly Christian or that require even necessarily a belief that the Bible is God's word, but rather to begin with sort of this idea of general revelation, which is what do we know is actually true about the real world. Let's start there and let's see, without bringing either a bias towards or against the supernatural component of things, let's just look at the evidence and follow it wherever it leads. And so that, that does end up narrowing down into ultimately the resurrection. And that's the big Christian claim, is that we believe that the creator of the universe also actually became a person, walked amongst us, put on flesh and blood, lived the life that we couldn't live, die the death that we deserve to die, which is that all of these things deserve unpacking, but then rose from the dead vindicating himself from those allegedly blasphemous claims that were the reason that he was crucified. So if that did really happen, where he said, "Hey guys, I'm going to give you what he called the sign of Jonah. So 3 days from now, you're going to see, like Jonah went into the belly of the of the ocean and the belly of the beast and came out 3 days later. I'm gonna give you the sign of Jonah," talking about his death, burial, and resurrection. So it's crazy because the Christian worldview literally comes down to a historic event that you actually can look at and you can fact check it and you can verify it and you can say, what is the plausibility that this actually explains the surrounding historical evidence? Is it more plausible that this happened due to what Christians believe? Or how else can we possibly explain the birth of the church, the changed convictions of the disciples, et cetera? We could go into all these things, but the documentary basically begins with the broadest level and then just slowly works towards that particular event, because that really is where the rubber meets the road. And if you remember the last line, I love it. I think the speaker's name is Donald Williams. He says, look to the place where the shadow of the cross rests on an empty tomb.
Yes. I was going to ask you about that because I still don't understand what he meant by that. I actually replayed that about 4 or 5 times and I still don't understand what he means by that.
So he's talking about, I believe he's talking about basically where can we find ultimate meaning and hope that explains the potential for life everlasting in light of the dire and horrific human condition that we're all faced with. And he says, look to the place where the shadow of the cross falls on the empty tomb. It's poetic, but what he's telling you is, if those two events are connected, if the Christ who was slain was in fact risen again, let me put that a different way. If the creator of everything incarnated himself, atoned for the things that make the world an evil, horrible place that it is, and then paid that price, and then actually absorbed all of that evil into himself, and then defeated it and transcended above death, and then calls himself the firstborn among many brethren, the first fruit. What that then means is that there is hope. And that means that as bad as things look and as much evil as we see in the world, it really is the case that there was an initial order, design, story, purpose, and meaning behind the human experience. And that means that the God who made us is also the God who saved us, and is also the God who is inviting us into that hope, that joy, and that life everlasting through relationship with him. So where the shadow of the cross rests on the empty tomb, if true, is the greatest possible news in light of the human condition.
Wow. That is so deep. That line is so deep. That's amazing. And now you've done a great job of explaining that and also explaining the ideas that you were trying to get across. But if I had to steelman it in another way, I'd say that perhaps the documentary, one of the goals of that documentary was to fix the problem of the way that religion is interpreted in modern day society. I mean, Christianity in your case, I must say Christianity. And in the sense that people often call themselves Christians and they often say that they, live by the laws of the Bible, but they don't actually embody that and they don't actually understand that, which is, I think, more fundamentally what you were trying to get across. And it kind of has become this cape that people can wear. It's like a costume that people can wear without actually really getting into the weeds of it. So would you say that helping people to actually understand the ideas of Christianity and the teachings of the Bible was one of the main goals of that documentary?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I think that in light of so many different things, it's necessary to deconstruct what we mean when we're using the words that we're using. And I can speak to this personally because for me, I was raised in a Christian home. I was familiar with the language. I was familiar with the stories. I could tell you, yeah, this happened, that's that character's name, whatever. But none of that really was my own thing. It was not personalized. I didn't really deeply believe it, and I didn't really, to be even more to the point, I did not have any type of relationship or connection to God until I was like 20, and I spent 2 years basically taking all of these things, putting them on the table and going, what do I actually believe about all of the culture and the church and these things that I was brought up in, what do I myself actually think about these? And I kind of went through those pieces on the table one by one, actually analyzing them, actually looking at what does scripture say, what does history say, what does science say, how do we like actually make sense of the world that we live in? And so once I had gone through that experience and realized that there is something so much deeper and richer and more real on the other side of that process, where you've actually found your own faith, then I became motivated to say, I think a lot of people have actually been inoculated with Christianity, where they've been given a small dose that has actually prevented them from getting the real thing. And I actually think that that's a huge problem, particularly in American culture, where everyone views Christianity like it's something. I'm American, I'm Christian, duh,
Mm.
and really that's not the same thing at all. So I do think it's extremely important to recognize that at the core of Christianity is a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. If you don't have one, if you're not talking to him, if you're not enjoying his presence, if he's not literally existentially the most important thing about your life, then you might just be in culture, or you might just be attending church, warming a pew, but you actually are not participating in legitimate Christianity.
There is so many different directions I want to go with this, so many different things that I want to cover, and we're going to get to those deeper ideas in a moment. But one of the things that left me wanting a little bit about the documentary was
Yep.
actually your own story. Because you mentioned that you went to Africa. I saw that a little bit. And if I'd give
Yep.
you one criticism of the documentary, it would have
Yeah.
been to incorporate more about your own story. And you mentioned how you went to Africa and how you were raised in sort of a regular middle class Christian home and you
Yep.
came to Christianity. It would have been very powerful to have maybe at the very end heard something a little bit more about your story. But maybe I could be wrong as well. So tell me a little bit about how you came to this and your life experiences and how they've synthesized to make the Daily Dose of Wisdom YouTube channel.
Well, no, I really appreciate that, man. And I've actually gotten that comment a couple times with people having watched the film. So I think your criticism is right, and I received that. And I don't have a time machine, but I'll implement that into the next project for sure. It's funny. I think the instinct to again make it less about me and more about the message is kind of that mailman analogy. Like I said, like I really do view myself as someone delivering a message, not a person who necessarily like is the main event or the main character or who possesses this, in that personalized way. But that being said, stories are powerful. And yeah, so for me, Africa became the catalyst through which I realized the extent that American culture and Christian culture have all kind of been mixed together. And what I was just describing a second ago, where like the language is in place, but the meaning beneath the language is not very widely understood by very many people who would call themselves Christian but are literally not. So that makes it such a confusing scenario. It's incredibly confusing to have these conversations, and um, but going to Africa, I realized like, okay, here's a wildly different cultural manifestation, but the part that I'm trying to talk, those core pieces that I'm trying to bring to light are in place, but without the baggage of televangelism in the same way, or without the baggage of the kid who had a negative experience in his Catholic school getting, corporal punishment, or without even the baggage in some ways of the Enlightenment project, where scientism became its own sort of religious system and where empiricism became the only epistemology that's taken seriously with arriving at truth. So in Africa, you're not in a post Enlightenment context culturally. And so it's like if you told people that there wasn't a spiritual realm, they would think you were crazy. You don't have to build a case to say, hear me out. What if love isn't material? What if what if meaning isn't material? What if even the conversation that we're having right now isn't material? Sure, there's audio passing back and forth and the bones in our ears are vibrating, but the actual conversation that we're having isn't material. You don't have to like go into any of that in Africa. It's like their cultural context is animism, where they believe in literally thousands of spiritual entities and witchcraft and all these different things. So for them, the apologetic or the way of like showing them Jesus is just who's the real God, who has more power, and it's literally displays of power. I mean, casting out demons. We can go into this if you want, but I've been involved in several exorcisms and some mass exorcisms where you're seeing dozens of people writhing, spasming, manifesting.
Yes. Okay. Let's go to that. I want to. I want to hear this because
Yeah,
I think it was. Well, yeah, it was Borat who did the whole. Went to the church and
yeah,
to
yeah,
the spirits and the tongues, and it was
yeah,
ridiculous. And I think that for the most part, because of those sort of representations that we've seen in the media and in movies, the
yes,
idea of exorcisms and the idea
yeah,
of expelling demons from you is thought of as ridiculous, and it's some sort of
right,
Middle Ages, Dark Ages thing. And I actually went to the cinema a few weeks ago, and there's a new movie out. I can't remember what it's called, but it's about a very famous exorcist
mm,
from, I think, the 20th century in Italy. And it was an awesome movie. And it started to make me think a little bit more about exorcism and about if it's actually plausible that people are
mhm,
possessed by demons. And then I
mhm.
saw Sam Smith doing his performance. And I saw these crazy things happening in our culture where I'm like, are we seeing minor manifestations of people being possessed by evil demon spirits? And the Sam Smith part is obviously a joke because he's wearing it like a costume and he's trying to
Right,
be as outrageous as possible. But
yeah,
there are aspects of the world where I think, God, that like the only way that you can really describe that is just evil, as just pure evil
yeah.
happening. So tell me a little bit about your experiences with exorcisms and give me what's the case for
Okay.
exorcisms.
So I'm glad that you're bringing up some of the cultural stuff and the stuff happening in America too. And I know that your channel focuses more on that. I'm so cautious to not like have someone stumble on a stumbling block before they get to like the cross. But I also think that the stuff that you're doing is amazing. And I think that it's actually a great way of leading into. I'll lead into my personal experience in Africa, but as for context, isn't it interesting that even in America, even in this post-enlightenment, we don't really believe in that stuff. You see this interest with the spiritual realm. You see even an interest with like Babylonian and Egyptian mythology and the Egyptian gods. You see like Katy Perry, the Eye of Horus. There's all of this intrigue, and of course, if you ask them, do you guys really believe in these gods? They're going to say no. It's art. It's a joke. It's whatever. But it's interesting that there is still this draw to it. And if you don't preclude the possibility that there actually is a spiritual realm, that there actually is a spiritual battle taking place, then from my perspective, I look at those things and I'm like, this is so funny that 4,000 years later Horus is still on television. Like, what are the odds of that? That's just wild, Or Sam Smith is dressed up like you said, like the devil. Like, how funny for a secular culture that doesn't believe in the devil, and there's definitely no like spiritual origin source for evil.
But
How yeah,
just
yeah, go
quickly
ahead.
on that one though, when we talk about these sorts of things, I, I know that it's just them. You can look at it as funny and people just sort of wearing a costume and they're just dressing up and it's just art or whatever. But
Yeah.
to me, sometimes I look at those performances and I think that you can't actually do that in good faith. You can't
Mhm.
actually, basically spit on the religion of so many billions of people around the world in
Yeah.
good faith. And I think that when we see that sort of thing, the conspiracy theorist in me makes me wonder who if there's strings being pulled behind the scene, but then the
Mhm.
spiritual part of me makes me wonder, is this the manifestation of some sort of satanic force that's permeating through the music industry? Because I don't see that as necessarily something that's just a little bit of art or just a bit of fun. My instinct when I see that sort of thing is like that's like it's almost evil, and it's almost projecting it outwardly and saying, this is what we're doing. We don't care about you know God and but your or any of your beliefs. And
Yeah.
yeah, something in me just doesn't quite sit right.
I think that I think that instinct, I think that you're picking up on something real there. And if you even, I'll give you another example. If you look at serial killers,
Hmm.
very many of them are actually Satanists. openly, and even in court. What's his name? David Ramirez holding up, 666 on the palm of his hand. So again, it's this weird thing where secular society, we don't believe in devils, and that's all, medieval. But at the same time, the people who are living out the greatest evil, they actually legitimately believe in Satan, and they're actually drinking dog's blood and actually doing all of these satanic practices, and even worse, satanic ritual abuse, and et cetera. If you look into serial killers, just as another like random reference point. But again, it's interesting where it's like it's all fun and games and art and joke and just joking around until it's not. So I don't know. We could have a whole other conversation about that. But I do think that the main thing is this: like the vast majority of all humans in history have believed in have not been empiricist and have believed in a spiritual realm and gods, goddesses in some variety or the other. And I would say, well, C.S. Lewis studied mythology at a incredibly deep PhD level throughout his life, was really like a leading expert in mythology. As a non-Christian, before he became a Christian, you probably know this, and he finally came to Jesus. And as a part of his conversion, he realized that Jesus was the myth made real, meaning he embodies these common traits of heroes, of Hercules, of et cetera, et cetera. He embodies these things, but he actually existed in history in a way that these people didn't. The Testament and the New Testament, the story in the New Testament is historic in nature. It's under the realm of Pontius Pilate in the year. So it baffled his mind because he says this contains the fulfillment of the greatest longings of mythology, but exists in history. What's going on here? And he finally concluded Christ is the myth made real. I think that's incredibly deep. It's a little bit of a side trail, but I think that it's important because that's just a reference point in the modern era of someone realizing, wait a second, what if the spiritual longing that humans have had since forever is not just this arbitrary longing, or it's not a longing that is somehow connected with biology, it's somehow evolutionarily beneficial. What if it actually was given to us by our creative source that we would long for ultimately him? What if that's the way that humans were wired and made, was to have a spiritual longing, to desire the creative source that made them? Like, I always use the analogy of fish in an aquarium, because when you're in that aquarium, you're like, of course there's nothing outside. I mean, that's the wall right there, bro. This is reality. And you see everything inside of that, but like you have a longing for something else. And I think people do have that heavenly longing, that desire for things to be different than how they are. And I think that all of that, from my perspective, points to, well, maybe that was, written into our hearts, so that people talk about a God-shaped hole in the human heart. Maybe it's meant to be filled by him. All of this leading up to modernism's Enlightenment project, the wide embrace of science, and the totally unnecessary divide that created between faith and science, as if they're mutually exclusive, as if to be scientific is to be a religious. And that was a completely unnecessary and I don't want to go conspiracy, but that happened for one reason or another. And unfortunately, as a byproduct of that, now even in school systems, your average person is just in school. They're taught evolution. They're taught nothing about God. And there's just things that are baked into the American cake ideologically that make the claims of the Bible come across as unreasonable. So, and the idea of deliverance or of exorcism is a classic example of that. When you have no context for that, other than, yeah, these crazy people in the medieval era used to think that there was like spirits, man. That's crazy. But we're so sophisticated now. We're so modern, and we've evolved beyond that now. And so it's that idea, again, Lewis talks about, of chronological snobbery. And he says, don't be so quick to judge, the vast tradition of human understanding, I do think there's a tremendous arrogance post-Enlightenment America where you're like a 17-year-old kid who took, biology, and you are absolutely certain that there is no spiritual realm.
Right.
And then, but for me, I go to Africa, and I'll tell you firsthand, I've seen it with my own eyes. I don't know of any other way to legitimately explain what I experienced firsthand than what I see also depicted in the pages of scripture.
What did you see?
We drove 5 hours down a dirt road into the absolute middle of nowhere to what, from a Christian perspective, we would call an unreached people group, meaning people who have never heard of the Bible, of Jesus, of any of that. And we built a projector, like a 12 by 12 projector, and we projected it's called like the Jesus film. It's basically just like, here's the story of that you see in the Gospels in the Bible. And so everyone sits down in the grass field and like watches this movie for, an hour and a half. By the end of the movie, there's probably like 300 people gathered and just sitting there watching. It was really cool. It was actually really beautiful. And there's like 10 pastors there. Like the sun is just like setting, and we're all just kind of like watching this thing. It was a really sweet moment. At the end, a couple of the pastors that we were like there partnering with get up, and they basically say like, hey, how'd you guys like the movie? And everyone's like, yeah, that was really cool, whatever. And then they go, well, just to let you guys know, like, that isn't only a story. It's not only a beautiful story, although it is a beautiful story, but that's also literally for everyone. It's for, like, Christ died for all so that all might live. And they're just, they're making that sort of like connection point. Like, this relates to you, like, because we, and I can, you can see I have a preaching instinct, so I can get a little bit too preachy here, but it's like the pastors start saying that. And so essentially it's like, hey, if you want Jesus in your life, if you want to have a relationship with him, then like come forward. We want to like talk to you, pray with you, and hear where you're at and what about him did you find compelling? So, out of the 300 or so people, probably like 40 or 50 people kind of come forward. So far, I'm like, okay, I know this. This is like what people would call like an altar call. It's like it's a call to action at the end of a service, basically. I have mixed feelings about them in general, but here we are having basically Africa style middle of nowhere altar call, basically. And I'm like, yeah, I know how this goes. So we're there, and I'm talking to this one girl. I'm through a translator because they're speaking this language called Chichewa, which is like not so. And I'm saying, what does she want prayer for? And then she's like, yes, like I'm feeling like there's a snake or something in my stomach. And I'm like, that's weird. So I'm praying for her. I'm like, if she has stomach pain, God, help with that and whatever else. And she's like, she's like, but I want Jesus. I want Jesus. I'm like, okay. And like all of this is kind of feeling like it's getting lost in translation because it's like it's a weird thing. Then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, and I tell the translator, I'm like, tell her I'm just gonna pray that she would like embrace, if she's wanting to embrace Jesus, like that he loves her, that he literally died for her, and if she wants to be with him, like she literally can be. There's nothing stopping her. Like that's what the whole thing was for. And so I said, just tell her that, and I'm just gonna pray for her, and you don't even have to translate. I'm just gonna pray that like the Holy Spirit like comes upon her, and that she like is basically like what Christians call born again, which I know all these words have baggage. Even as I'm saying it, I'm like, someone's watching this video and they're like, oh boy, I've seen that on TV before, but whatever. Like, it's just the idea that God meets with her and the dots are connected. Her will is saying yes to God. So God proposed to humanity on the cross. Will you be with me? Here's how much I love you. Here's what I'm willing to do for you. I want to be yours forever. And the cross is where he holds out basically a gold ring, and is like a proposal to humanity. This particular girl in that moment is saying, I do. Yes, I receive your invitation. I want you. Then all of a sudden, as I'm praying for her, she falls to the ground, and basically starts writhing like a snake. And I'm just like looking to the translator, what's going on? And he's like, oh, and he is like, oh yeah, we know what this is. Like he immediately like jumps into action, and they basically start praying for her and or start saying, you have to come out, you have to come out in Jesus' name. Like the Holy Spirit is entering her. You're not allowed here anymore. You don't have any authority. Like in Jesus' name, get out of her. And then basically, I look up though, and essentially that same thing is happening. Dozens of people are all independently like slithering. There's some of the women were taking off their skirts and exposing themselves to the pastors to like distract. I again, the whole point of this story is that there is a spiritual realm, so I'm just going to say it how I see it, which is that spirit is using sex to distract the pastor and to just do something crass and ridiculous to fight against what's happening in this moment. I mean, so this is happening. So I mean, imagine seeing this in like the sideways light of this projection screen in this dirty field. You just see this insane like event happening. Uh, it goes on for like 2 hours,
Wow, that's
and
incredible.
yeah, I mean, it wasn't just like, did I imagine that? Like it's like, and you can feel it too. Like it is like if you haven't experienced anything dark or evil or spiritual warfare, like you don't know what I'm talking about. If you have, you can feel that sense of like fear and evil, and just like there's just a present, like there's like warfare happening right now. So anyway, 2 hours later, the dust has settled. These people like that. I don't want to cry on camera, but that particular girl is just so beautiful. Like her face, the like the peace and the calm and just like the sense of like escape and freedom that you could see on her face and her countenance was unbelievable. And anyway, so it was probably all just a psychological whatever, right? Like there's no spiritual realm, and it was all just like hocus, So that's how you view it. It's either just what a mass psychosis event that somehow is triggered by the name of Jesus, by the story of Jesus, and like one thing led to another. And then I understand like that like secular narrative of way of explaining it, but being there and seeing it and like looking at all of these pieces next to each other, it's like if you'll just accept this one premise that there is a spiritual component to reality, then that immediately solves the entire rest of that equation. And it's sometimes again the simplest solution, like our Wi-Fi connection today, is actually the most sensical. So
Wow.
I'm sure you have questions.
Yes. So first of all, you said that it's an unreached people. So you're telling me that these people have never heard of God, they've never heard of Jesus, they're they have no spiritual alignment whatsoever.
They have witch doctors, and so it's an animistic culture, meaning the witch doctors are the spiritual authority, and they basically believe in like all kinds of different spirits, and they have idols. They believe that like the idols have spirits. I mean, it's some of the stuff is really dark too. Like they will make an idol with a erection and have sex with it to be like spiritually impregnated by a spirit that they believe will bless them. Those witch doctors will slice when the baby's born into the village, will slice above the buttocks and collect the blood from the baby and have it on a vial in their house basically. And that's like the blood is like a spiritual protective thing. So there's a whole religious system that is demonic. I mean, it's demonic.
Right.
Um,
Okay. So do you think that perhaps, and let me play devil's advocate here
do it.
for
Yeah.
literally, um, do you think that perhaps there was perhaps some part of their culture, and by the sounds of what they believe in with the witch doctors and everything,
Yep.
there would be maybe some part of their culture where they're actually that's actually a social construction of theirs, where they have all of these demonic, like the demonic sort of ability to be able to turn themselves into a snake, and sounds like it's a very sexual culture as well in terms of some weird sort of sexual customs. So do you think that perhaps that was a construction of their culture, what happened? Is that a reasonable objection?
Um, Yeah, in terms of the manifestation, I think yes. But I don't think it, so there's two, I'm not sure which one you're saying. Like, uh, because, for example, like they are in a culture where snakes exist in that part of the world, is that something that they have in their imagination? Is that like a symbol that represents like power that
Or
then
is that
uh,
even something, the fact that they all dropped to the ground and started acting like snakes and exposing themselves to the pastors, is that something that perhaps is in some way practiced?
oh, like as a positive thing?
Is it kind of like, say they have a ritual that you guys don't know about where the acting like a snake is, I mean, it's very unlikely what I'm saying here, because
Yeah,
why would they act like snakes of all things? It's like, of all of the things that they could act like, snake is the most biblical representation of evil. So um
yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that, do you think that what they were doing was somehow socially constructed by another
But do you mean
ritual that
like
they
as a
have in?
middle finger? Is that what you mean? Like, oh, like you're bringing this to us, and we're giving you like our response to this is middle finger. Cultural manifestation of that is snake slithering.
Yeah, yeah.
The reason it definitely wasn't that is that those people that came forward were the ones that were like saying yes to our message, and you could again, it's one of those things. It's like when you see it, you're like, I can literally see the person, and I can see this internal conflict. And it's not like they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna get you. It's like it's like you can see this internal battle, and like before we pray for the people, they're coming in. They're like, yes, like we want, like we love, we're saying again, we're saying yes to that proposal. But then it was like you could see like something else, almost like a person like loses their mind, something else like comes out.
Hmm.
But then at the end of it, the person is like there, like I said, like the one girls that I was with throughout this, which is beautiful, just the most beautiful, like
I can see
relief.
how moved you are by it. It sounds like something that was quite an incredible experience.
It
Um,
was, and I just want to say, like, it wasn't like she was like, "Oh, I'm gonna." It wasn't a middle finger thing because like I said, it was like you could see the person you were dealing with. This crazy thing happened, and at the end of it, they were like, "Thank you, that was insane." Like,
right. I
if
guess
that makes
another thing that I'm picturing myself as one of the listeners right now.
as
I
we
guess
ought.
yes. So one of the biggest arguments that I hear about this sort of thing is that there are all of these religious experiences that are happening around the world, but then
Yeah.
people will say, "Well, why does no one film it? Why don't we see this sort of thing happening?" So, do we have any actual proof of these sorts of events happening?
Yeah, there's a ton of video footage of this, especially in Africa and all over Africa television. The tricky part is, and this goes back to what we were talking about with Sam Smith and stuff, is, and it's like, and this goes back to American culture in general, is there's so many ridiculous, hokey, counterfeit manifestations of thing where everyone's like, that's like obviously acting. There's so many televangelists with the fake miracle, with the fake healing story. There's the Steve Martin movie about it. There's all these things, and like, so it's like, yeah, but there is a ton of stuff on video. It's just up for you behind the screen to go, is that legit? Is this real? What's going on here? And so that's what it is. It's like, I mean, again, if you are coming at this from the perspective that I am, which is that there really is like a spiritual battle, it's like a really good strategy would be to present a lot of hocus pocus,
Hmm.
so that everyone's like, well, that like basically X isn't true, so Y also isn't true. And also, after all, I took biology class, or I'm an American. Like, what are we talking about? Of course, this isn't true. So it's like, I don't know. But yeah, there's tons of videos of that.
Right. Yeah, okay, interesting. And I think the other thing that people would listen to that sort of thing and be like, well, it can't be true, is because of the actual nature of what's happening. When you say exorcisms and when you say being possessed by sort of these demonic spirits, do
Yeah.
you think that this is sort of like the counter to God, but similar in a certain way, in the sense that this force is an omnipotent force that tries to, like, perhaps win over certain people and try and dominates in certain places and parts of the world. But or do you think that this is like fallen angels, people who have passed on to the other realms who can then possess
Yeah.
the body? What is the nature of this beast?
It's not like one beast. It's I mean there's a lot written and studied about this, and there's slightly different viewpoints in terms of like what's the difference between an angel and like the disembodied spirit of a Nephilim, or like there's like all these like, but there is a sense within even like the writings of Paul in the New Testament, where he talks about that there's some powers and principalities and spiritual, like, or there's an organization of intelligent evil in some way. It's this is like not the primary reason to be a Christian or to think about Christianity, because like I don't really know exactly what all like who exactly were we dealing with there? Was that a general? Was that a private? I have no idea. Like,
Mm.
but it's just this idea of that there was, in the same way that there was a fall, and we haven't even talked. We should talk more offline about like actually your basis point and whatever. But like, I don't know even how much of like scripture you're familiar with, but
Well, firstly, I will say that what you said just then, intelligent, organized evil, that resonated with me quite a lot. I think we're seeing some of that. But my
yeah,
basis point, just it's probably actually good to understand this, is
yeah,
that I was similarly to you brought up in my school was Catholic school,
okay,
and we read the Our Fathers every day and that sort of thing. But then I got kicked out of a few high schools, and I went up to like 4 high schools. I was a bit of a naughty boy. So for me, it was just something that was there. I never really took it too seriously. In hindsight, I find that reading all of those prayers, being forced to do it as a kid at mass and everything, you get a little bit maybe desensitized to it at times, and it
Mhm.
becomes just
Yeah.
a thing that you say rather than something that has any sort of profound meaning to you.
Mhm.
So that happened, and then I graduated school, had absolutely zero interest in religion. I actually ended up working at the Salvation Army for 2 years, and I was working with the homeless, and everyone, they were like Bible thumping Christians at the
Yeah.
Salvation Army, which was
Yeah.
interesting. And I was that cocky guy who had watched a few Christopher Hitchens videos and would debate them all and tell them
Yeah.
that they what they believe is bullshit. And then the pandemic happened, COVID pandemic,
Yeah.
and I started to look a little bit more into what was happening. And at this stage, I wasn't politically minded at all. I wasn't really paying attention to what was happening in the culture. And I
Mhm.
started to see a few things happening around me that I began to become quite repulsed by. And
Yeah.
it made me question the nature of human beings at first, because obviously if there is no spiritual realm, then I have to question the societal structures that we've made that make human beings like that. And then obviously the logical conclusion of that is you eventually you come to questioning what's more fundamental than the nature of human beings, which is the nature of reality and the nature of existence and the nature of
Mhm.
evil and the nature of good. So I came to those things, and then very slowly over the past few years, I've been trying to explore faith and religion. I've gone from a place where I was extremely intellectually curious about it, brought upon
Mhm.
probably by Jordan Peterson, and now I've gotten to a place where I'm starting to understand, and actually with a lot of help from your documentary, that I think that the Christian worldview is actually real. Because um yeah, I never actually really thought I'd be saying this, and it's weird to be saying it like on a podcast as well. But when you understand the cosmological argument, the one that you put forward, if something comes into being, then there has to be a creator.
Right.
Then that's pretty moving. And then you think, what is the creator? What's the nature of this creator? How do we know that this creator is good? How do we know that this creator is not evil? How do we know that we're not living in a simulation where somebody's just pressed a button and a big bang happened and then all of a sudden we're here?
Right.
How do we know
Right.
that, like the Red Hot Chili Peppers say in one of their songs, ever wonder if it's all for you? How do you know that you're not the center of this
Right.
artificial intelligence? Um, and then you begin to look into the stories of the Bible a little bit more, and you begin to look into. And by the way, my understanding is rudimentary. Let me just tell you first of all. And you begin to look into the story of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, and you begin to understand that his death was the most recorded event in ancient history. So
Mhm.
if we believe that Tutankhamun existed, why don't we believe that Jesus Christ was executed on the cross?
Yeah.
And then his disciples died for that, and they believed that they saw him walking on water. They believed that they saw him rising from the dead. And this couldn't have been some mass psychosis because we don't believe those sorts of things. That's actually illogical. And then you start to understand that, okay, well, what explains that? Because if you're telling me that it was a mass psychosis, and if you're telling me that all of the historical records are wrong, then that, in my opinion, is very illogical. I think what a more logical understanding of that would be to say that all of the eyewitness testimonies are correct, and that Jesus of Nazareth did die on the cross, and he did rise from the dead, and he did walk on water. He did turn water into wine. He did create feasts out of nothing. He did heal people of their sickness. And if there must be something else there. So I guess that's where I'm at the moment. And then another thing that was very important for my development was understanding the atheist arguments and how they can actually be debunked. That's a big breakthrough. When I
Yeah.
was, I think I found, like, hitherto my studies, I found the uh, relativistic argument very compelling. I also found the materialist argument very compelling. And there was
Mhm.
another one that you put forward in the
Uh, oh,
documentary,
in the documentary. I
yeah,
mean, religious pluralism, it is
pluralism.
relativism kind of plugged into religion, and it kind of manifests as pluralism, all paths, all religions are getting you to the top of the same mountain. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And the other one that I found very compelling was, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Zeitgeist documentary.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I
Very
watched
familiar.
that and I was like, it's over, debate
Yeah.
over, because
Yeah.
you've got all of these different religions around the world who have all of these aligning factors, and then think that
Yes.
Christianity is real, but then thousands of years before that you had um, all of these ancient Egyptian religions that were exactly the same, and the
Yes.
Greek mythology follows the same path. And I found those arguments very compelling in my
Yes.
more atheistic times, but then being able to refute those arguments is, and I look at this very critically, by the way. Like
Yeah.
when I'm refuting these arguments, I take them extremely seriously, because I'm lucidly aware of the fact that there is a part of my brain that wants comfort and that wants to understand the existential issues with the world, and that wants
Right.
to understand that perhaps there's something there for me when I die, and that the material world is not everything, and that the people who I've lost in the past, when my dad died, that he's going to somewhere that's not eternal darkness. So
Yeah.
I'm very aware of those senses within me as well. So I take a
Mhm.
very critical eye to these issues. But that's my rant over.
I think it's well, I have so many thoughts on this. Number one, I think it's awesome to hear what you just said. And I think that the journey that you're on is actually a more difficult journey than the person who doesn't have all of that baggage to work through and who is just like, hey, by the way, and they just hear it for the first time. I think to go from, like I said, it's literally like you were probably inoculated to some extent in Catholic school and you have these things and then you kind of went on the farther side and now it's like it requires a extreme level of humility to go back and say but wait a second that's very it's even just psychologically you don't want to feel like you're going backwards, and you're not going backwards. Neither did I go backwards, but I did have to go through that process of legitimately thinking through all of the implications of what is in the Bible and actually what's going on over here with I watched the Zeitgeist too. What's going on over here, and what about Christopher Hitchens and what Richard Dawkins and like all these things. Like it's just that process of legitimately evaluating everything rather than predetermining that something must not be true based on a notion that you absorbed through culture, school, family, whatever.
Hmm.
And I think that when all cards are put on the deck I, uh, Christ is very compelling when everything is thought through, and there is definitely still a level of faith required. I'm not saying it's not a math equation that has an inevitable solution that all people lead to. Obviously, there is faith that's required in this. I'm not saying that, but a holistic look at reality, it's very compelling. The other thing that I loved what you said is talking about the zeitgeist stuff. I love how what at one time for me were the most damning and damaging arguments are now some of the most like intriguing and in a sense like beautiful and compelling for the alternative reasons. And what shifted my perspective on this, there's an essay that was written by Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings. The essay is called On Fairy Stories. He was friends with Lewis, and they had a thing called the Inklings where they would meet up weekly and discuss philosophy, culture, mythology. And he was also studying mythology at a super deep level. And in his essay on fairy stories, he starts to pull out these common ingredients that exist inside of mythology. And well, he calls it a fairy story, but his definition of a fairy story is, what does a human being write about when it's not tethered to history and they just say once upon a time? And the interesting thing about once upon a time is it is pure creative imagination. You can do anything you want. Oh yeah, so there's a knight and he slays the dragon to get the damsel in distress. And that, let's say that was written in like in that's a Anglo-Saxon mythology story. But then wait a second, over here in China, you have this. And over here in Mesoamerica, you have this. And in the Norse mythologies, you have this. And he pulled out these common ingredients and he realized, oh my gosh, no matter when or where, when a human being sits down and writes a fairy story, they have these ingredients that include love, overcoming, a hero laying down his life, the idea of an everlasting. And he goes on and he pulls out these things and he goes, what if we manifest these stories because they are our story? What if those longings and desires actually have a fulfillment, and that's why they're pervasive across time and space? And to me, that completely inverted the zeitgeist thing, where it's like, oh my gosh, people want a dying and rising savior. This is crazy. And they wanted it 1,000 years before Christ. So in other words, the fact that you have all these like sort of counterfeits or mythologies doesn't mean that you don't have a real thing. And in fact, it means like there's something so compelling. And it's even like in the start, like zeitgeist goes into the cosmology of that. Why does that, and this gets a little weird. I don't totally buy into this, but like, how they talk about that, like the sun, and they point to these like astrological phenomenon as the impetus for the mythology. But what if the astrological phenomenon and the mythology are both rooted in a deeper impetus, which is the reality of God himself, giving us these clues, planting within us these longings, and then ultimately providing us a fulfillment of the true myth, like I said, Christ,
Right.
the true myth.
Yeah. And this is something that's tried to be explained by people throughout history. I think Carl Jung has his book Archetypes of the Unconscious Mind.
Yes.
And then even Richard Dawkins tries to explain this with his meme theory as well. So it's interesting how different people try and tell this story in different ways. But
yeah,
I've actually haven't heard of that, but I'll have to read that essay.
It's so good. It's so cool. Anyway, all of that was just to say we have a similar journey of like, it's not a straight line. It's like spiraling and it's complicated. And I think that's required in I think being, you're based in Europe, right?
I'm currently in Europe. Yes.
Okay. So, but are you a byproduct of Western civilization?
I'm Australian. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So like we both have that. I think there's a additional homework task required of anyone in 2023 who is a byproduct of Western civilization. That is another layer of analysis, which is how did I get the things that I got initially? and then what do I actually believe on top of that?
Absolutely. I'm in Romania at the moment, and I walk around in the I get woken up in the morning by the church bells at
Yeah.
8 a.m. and people gathering at the church in their communities to, give thanks. And it's like it's a shock to the senses. And it's so beautiful. And people like are really unified by their faith. And I find it very, very interesting. But another thing I wanted to talk about, and it's sort of similar to this sort of relative idea, and
Mhm.
I found this absolutely fascinating when I was watching this in your documentary. The way that you broke down the way that the different religions work and how different religions actually have sort of different manifestations in the world, and
Mhm.
um, especially how I think you talked a little bit about Islam and how it was more in the sort of it comes down to a sense like a set of laws, and it's more of
Mhm.
like a legal require like Sharia law is what their religion's built around, and then a few other religions, and I'm going to absolutely butcher this, but then how you believe that Christianity is actually an outlier. So, do you mind, to the best of your ability,
Mhm.
explaining that phenomenon a little bit? Because it gives a very new light. It did for me anyway on the whole. Like, if you're born in Pakistan, then you are going to be this religion. So, what does that mean? Are you just going to go to hell, or you're born in this place? You're going to be of this religion. So, if you don't mind
Yeah,
unpacking that a little
so
bit.
there's a couple different things there. I'll give my best answer to what I think you're asking, and then tell me if I interpreted it wrong, and I can I can do a second pass at it. But if you're asking the question of how does Christianity stand apart from other religions in terms of what it claims is the way of salvation, then it's very dramatic because in in a variety of different ways, I mean, I would actually say this. I would actually say true Christianity is not a religion. And either people would say that's complicated because there is the church, and people disagree on that. But for the point that I'm trying to make, um, let me put it this way. Religion is man's attempt to get to God through practices, behaviors, rites, rituals. Christianity is a proclamation and understanding of a message, of a story that contains in it a literal truth, which is that God has come to us, that God incarnated himself, that he died for us, that he rose for us, that he's alive today, and that he desires relationship with us. But the point is, I mean, there's a lot I can say on that, but at the essential point of how do we please God? That's the real question of religion. How do we please God? How do we unite ourselves to God? Religion, every other religion says in a variety of ways, strap the glass to your knees and go up the temple, up the steps of the temple and bleed out to atone for yourself and to get to the high place and to be then pleasing to God. Do this, do that. Christianity says, no, he bled for you. The price has been paid. The atonement is done. Christ literally died for you so that you don't have to atone for your own wrongdoings, wrong thinkings, everything else. Christ literally laid down his life for you.
I have to ask. I find this fascinating when people are telling these stories, and I'm sorry if I'm treating you like a zoo animal here, but I find it fascinating when people tell these stories and they're so moved by it, because I've found myself reasonably moved by the ideas of Christianity, and
Yeah.
I've found myself in quiet moments of dwelling, speaking to something that I'm not sure what I'm speaking to, and I guess you could call that prayer, and
Mm.
and but I find it very interesting when people are so emotionally moved by these. Why does that move you so much when you speak about the story of Jesus?
Because I know him and I love him,
Mm.
and he has doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on me and on revealing himself to me. And I spend time with him every single day. And so the things that I'm saying are not in the realm of the abstract. It's not just informational. It's the most personal and rich and real thing about who I am. And my heart is sensitive toward him as a process of being with him and spending time with him. And he, day by day, um, and this sounds arrogant to say, I'm not, I have so much to learn and so far to grow, but I can tell you that he sensitizes your heart when you're with him, and he softens that part of you. And it's not just informational. It's like, it's the same way that you would get emotional or whatever if you're talking about your wife and you're like, oh, it was amazing, she did this thing for me, like she, she means that much to me. And that's just how it is for me. It's just spending time with them.
That's beautiful, man. And I'm honestly happy. And like, I feel icky saying this, but I'm actually jealous. I'm jealous that you have that, um, because it's a very beautiful thing to see, and I can tell how much that's enriched your life. But that's the one thing that I question a lot is the fact that when somebody says that they have a relationship with
Yeah.
God and relationship with Jesus. Now, obviously, I understand that the idea is that that God and I guess it's let's just say God because they're one thing, right?
Yep.
So the God is omnipotent. It's not like God's running around like Santa Claus trying, oh, help you, help you, help you, help you. No,
Yep.
it's something that's always there, and it's something that's all powerful and
Mhm.
like I said, omniscient. Like we something that we can't possibly comprehend the power of it. But when you say that you have a relationship with God, do you speak
Mhm.
out loud? Is it internal thoughts? What does that look like?
The best way I can describe this, and yeah, you speak out loud, you pray quietly while you're driving, but those particulars don't really matter. This is probably more helpful, especially for that person listening that we ought to always have in mind who is thinking that this is all wildly crazy. Um, we have a relationship now. It's a brand new relationship, but um, if you think about it this way, and this is going to get a little bit philosophical, but we know that we have a relationship. How? Because
Like,
we're,
yeah,
yeah, we'll go, you answer that.
yeah, okay. Well, we've been emailing and we've been exchanging compliments, and now we're on a podcast, and I'm looking at you face to face, and we're virtually interacting.
Yes. So so what you're saying is through the screen and through the audio
And the pixels in my computer, and
and the pixels, there's different like conduits through which information has flowed,
yes,
and that information contains meaning, and the meaning contains also a sense of an emotional to an aspect. Like I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm getting a backstory for you, and I feel like I'm growing in knowledge of you as we're making content.
mm,
But the pixels, the audio piece, these are the conduits through which the relationship is taking place.
yes,
With God, the scripture is one conduit. It's he is able to speak into the heart through the pages of scripture. Um, he's also able to speak directly without an audible voice. He doesn't need to use audio in the vibration of the bones in the ear. He's able to speak directly into the heart, which is the same place that in the mind, which is the same place that all of our conduits lead to anyway. It ultimately leads to your heart and into your mind. God is able to, as the creator of time, space, and matter, essentially circumvent those natural mechanisms for communication and say, as I pray to him in the morning on my drive or whatever, man, that sunset is amazing. I love that sunset. That's just beautiful. Like that's one of a kind. I love that. And then something is downloaded mystically into my heart. Yeah, I love you.
mm. Do you?
And
And I'm going to ask you a question. It's going to sound like I'm taking the mic, but I'm not. I promise. Do you ever wonder if you're crazy?
no, I don't want to them crazy because of the Jewish idea of shalom, which is that truth shalom exists when truth and goodness and beauty are married together in a central location.
Mm.
And so when when I'm communicating with God, is I'm getting into shalom, which is the exact opposite of crazy, and where there's chaos, disorder, confusion, and even if you like talk with paranoid schizophrenics or something, it is not a pleasant experience. It's like he's telling me to do that. They're all talking to me at once. And there's this weird assignment. It's not a pleasant experience. So I mean, that's one reason why. And again, just through, I mean, in the same way that I think, I mean, I don't want to suppose this, but I think that perhaps through this conversation, that God has maybe been beneath the surface talking to both of us as well, if you know what I mean, in the sense of when you have that aha moment, when you talked about um, you appreciated organized intelligent evil as a way of framing the darkness that seems to exist.
Mm.
Something like that, those little like revelation or insight things that are of more of a spiritual nature, I would say have something to do with how God can like move the needle.
That's
Although,
interesting. I want to touch that for a second,
yeah, yeah,
um, because I I actually thought that myself, but I think it comes down to a place of being a little bit too self-conscious and not quite being there, that I'd be
yeah,
willing to say that's God working. Like the fact that I
yeah,
was looking for answers in
yes,
terms of I wanted somebody to lay it out for me, give me, steel man the case for this for me. And then I came across
yes.
your channel and you were able to speak to me in a way that like I hadn't been. Another guy I listen to is Ruslan. Have you know Ruslan?
I love him.
I listen to everything he does. I love that guy. But
Yep.
you were able to speak to me in a slightly different way, and in a way that I connected with a little bit more, because it was a little bit more philosophical, and you were like you went into the ideas, which I like. And then that documentary spoke to me in a big way. So if I don't think I'm not quite ready to say it yet, but if I was to be in the place where you're at, for example, I
Mhm.
would say that that's God working. I asked because I literally physically out loud asked, and then I
Mhm.
received. So that's very interesting. It's very interesting to hear you say that.
Yeah, and I want to say this also, like personality, I think, does matter. I don't think every single person connects with God the same way. There's probably people that are Christians that are listening to this that are of a slightly different faith tradition or denomination or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not totally comfortable with the way that he's talking about that." And so, like, there's a ton of space and freedom for personality to play a real role in that. And not everyone, even in their marriage with their physical, literal, like wife, is as emotional or you know what I'm saying? Like, so it's don't. I always tell people like, don't ever just pursue God, and like he knows you. He knows the amount of hairs on your head, and he knit you and formed you in your mother's womb. He loves you. He knows exactly like the way that you work, and like I'm like nobody compare your relationship with God with anybody else. Just pursue God, like pursue Christ, and like He will take care of the rest. Like it's not some weird like performative
Mm.
ritualistic thing. It's just like however you are as a person is going to be similar to the way that you are with God.
Absolutely. And so we mentioned before the idea of organized, intelligent evil. And then remind
Yes.
me of how you described the idea of shalom and good.
Hmm.
Remind me of that. How did you
Oh, I thought you said
describe
it reminded you. Goodness, truth, and beauty
goodness, truth?
married together.
Yes. Organized, intelligent evil. And then on the other hand, you have goodness, truth, and beauty. I think that's very profound when you think about those two things on the opposite ends of the spectrum to one another. And this is why this leads me into my next point quite perfectly, in the sense that we're looking around at our culture at the moment. Goodness, truth, and beauty, in my opinion, are being done away with. And I think the evidence is insurmountable that we're moving away from that. And I think that at times it's organized, intelligent evil that is moving us away from that intentionally. It's almost sometimes feels like it's spitting in the face of goodness, truth, and beauty. And my instinct is to fight when I see that, because I consider myself to be a fighter. And when I see that, I want to attack. And when I look at the church, sometimes I think, yeah, it's okay to turn the other cheek and to live in the image of God and to act like Jesus, but I think we're in a situation right now where we need to fight, and where just having faith sometimes isn't. My instinct tells me that just having faith isn't going to really help us with central bank digital currencies, and how having faith isn't going to help us with people trying to restrict our freedoms, and
Mhm.
with all of the other all of the things that are happening in schools at the moment, indoctrination of children. And having faith isn't going to bring back the old beautiful Renaissance architecture from European cities that's now being replaced with commie blocks. And having faith isn't going to make people do. Oh, it probably actually will. That is the one thing that makes people do beautiful art. But yeah, and sometimes when the pessimist inside me says that just having faith alone isn't going to help us with these not existential, but with these giant issues that are moving us so rapidly away from truth, goodness, and beauty, and
Mhm.
towards organized, intelligent evil. So, how would you combat that issue?
I love that question.
Mm,
I love this so much. This is like you're teeing me up right now because I have so much to say on this. Um, Christless conservatism is not the answer, because the problem is not just values deep. The problem is spiritual level deep. And so it's not a matter of faith being this abstract thing that keeps you out of the real world and away from action. And it's not just that faith in any old object does anything good at all. It's faith in the right object. It's connection to, again, if we're really saying that there's a creator of the universe, if we're really saying that he incarnated himself, if we're really saying that you can connect to God through Christ, suddenly now we get to the mission of God. And this is why I love what you're saying, because Christ didn't just say, all right, ship shape. He said, go ye into all the world. He said, build my kingdom. And by the way, it's unshakable, but build my kingdom. The Jewish expectation for Messiah was that he would come as a war leader and that he would conquer Rome, because Rome was oppressing the Jews in Second Temple Judaism in the first century. And their expectation of Messiah was a literal war hero, a conquering king. But they also had another expectation of Messiah, which was that he would also be a suffering servant. Those were the two broad umbrellas that the prophecies followed: a conquering king and a suffering servant. A lot of Jewish thought actually thought that those were two different characters. There was a whole branch that there was going to be two different messiahs. But all of a sudden you have Jesus, who in the most unexpected way imaginable is both the conquering king through the suffering servant. And then the resurrection piece comes in, and then he says, the kingdom of heaven is upon you. It's within you. Go and basically change the world. And that's exactly what his followers did. The disciples of Jesus, upon belief in the truth claim that he made about himself being the Messiah, literally changed the world. They all died for it, but they also went, and that message, there's an entire book written about this called Lift, which looks at the lift in every single category of society that takes place when Christianity enters it, in terms of sanitation, in terms of the reduction of crime, in terms of, I mean, in every category. And this still exists to this day when you go into like the third world or this or that. And this, by the way, also now I want to stay condensed here, but I have to do a quick parenthetical, because I know someone's hearing that and they're thinking about colonialism, and they're thinking about the negative damages of like a Christian nation going into India or Africa. And I have to do a quick parenthetical on this, which is that there were three types of people that came from the West or from a Christian nation into those places. There was the merchant, there was the military, and there was the missionary. And they were not the same type of people, and they had wildly different motivations. And so, but although they all had white skin, and although they were coming from country A to country B, you had this wildly different effect where you do have some military people mistreating, or you have the merchant taking advantage in terms of commerce. But then at the same time, you have the missionary coming and bringing that lift. But it's confusing and it's intricate, because you have to look and say, who specifically did what? Yes, the white person did that, and that was bad. But then that white person did that and shared with those people the gospel, and all of a sudden, and I even saw this in Africa, all of a sudden the husband has his arm around the wife, which would never happen for thousands of years. You never see public affection. That man's breaking a cultural standard and expressing love to his wife externally and shamelessly. I guarantee you that's a Christian man. So, and I could go into so many examples of this. So that's the parenthetical on that. I'm not saying that it's not complicated, and it has nothing to do with like Western civilization or even Christendom. I'm talking about the kingdom of heaven as this undercurrent beneath the movement, anywhere, any which direction. Now it's happening in China. The Chinese Christians are coming to America, and the kingdom is advancing there. So all of this to say, that's just my caveat, but all of this to say, the mission of God. We need to work alongside of God through the power of his spirit and in light of his conquering on the cross and his conquering in the resurrection and the hope that he's offering people forever. We need to move in all of these cultural areas that you're talking about. I mean, there's so many things that we could talk about, but we need to move with that ultimate purpose level of understanding like there is a time coming when every tear will be wiped away, when the sorrow will be done away with, and also when every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. In other words, there's an ultimate revelation, there's an ultimate fulfillment that is coming. And with the confidence of that, although things are getting worse, definitely, they will get better. If he's telling the truth, if God really is Jesus, really did do what he did, and then he says, by the way, my kingdom is unshakable. Supposing that's all true, we have so much confidence to pursue, and we can go through the issues. I love your channel, bro. I love what you're tackling culturally, but I want to push back so hard on the idea that the faith-based people are often the ivory tower, pondering their navel. It's like, no way. Like true Christianity, you're in the trenches, and that has been the case. I mean, Christians started hospitals to begin with. I mean, and there's so many things that you can go to in terms of the fingerprint. I would say the fingerprint of Christ on culture through the people of God who have understood, oh my goodness gracious, if this is all really real, this changes everything about how we live and the work that we do and what our life is for.
Right. I love that you brought up my channel there. And it's funny because we have such a different message, but like I think that we want the same thing.
Yeah.
But my obviously I'm a little bit more risque and juvenile in my humor and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I'd like to think that I'm a conduit for many people, to individuals like Jordan Peterson and even yourself, for example. I hope that people will realize that we'll see this podcast and then go deep into your content as well. But yeah, I do like to think that I'm good for like entertainment, and I can get pretty philosophical sometimes, but I do hope that people will see the people that I'm talking about, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, and all of these very profound thinkers, and go much deeper into them after listening to my content. But I'm going to stay with my juvenile humor for just 1 second and say, don't you think if this does happen, and if Jesus was to come back, and if the kingdom of heaven was to be solidified, and if every tear was to be wiped, every knee would bow, wouldn't that be a bit boring?
Absolutely not.
Why not?
Because evil doesn't make things interesting. I'll agree that like the story of evil being overcome is interesting, but you don't want evil to persist for the sake of a good story, number one. And number two, we really have absolutely no idea of the limits of God's creative imagination and ability to make things wildly interesting. We just don't. The Bible even just doesn't speak into that. But if you look at the insanely beautiful, complicated, meaningful, intricate universe that exists that he created, if you look at the amazing ability that we have right now to have conversation, to go into these types of things, I mean, it's like, God is so limitless. And I even think this is kind of weird, but I always think about like the sex act as this thing that like all humans hold so dear. It's like the most pleasurable and connecting and deep and rich and meaningful thing. And God says like, okay, that is a metaphor. It's a symbol for the union between man and God at the wedding feast of the Lamb. So marriage itself is like a metaphor, a symbol. It's obviously a real thing, but it's also telling us something about what is to come.
That's interesting.
And in my mind, I'm like, oh, by the way, God is also capable of coming up with I don't know, 10 billion other similarly amazing, pleasurable things that are also metaphor. So it's just limit. I mean, if we're really talking about God, we're talking about limitless possibilities of entertainment. If that's your
So you're saying that if I had to do away with my current version of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, there would be another more fulfilling.
Yes, and it would, and by the way, it would have everything to do with him. This is another funny thing. People think of heaven as like, oh, the streets of gold. Okay, that's cool. I'm kind of on board with that. Oh, it's like pointing to all of these outward things, and the whole idea is that like, what's cool about gold? Oh, it's like there's something about gold that has something to do with God. There's something about sex that has something to do with God. And our drugs or rock and roll, like like everything is a reflection of a shadow of a type, sometimes a perversion of, but still pointing back to the source. And so there's a quote, I forgot who it's from, but I love it. And it says, the great reward of heaven is no manifested thing, but is God himself. The great reward of heaven is God. And he in himself, you'll be in a good spot. Don't worry about it.
That's interesting, man. And dude, Brandon, there are so many other places that I would like to take this, and I think that this
I
definitely
know.
won't be the last time we chat to each other because I've
Yeah,
had such a good time. But the last
same.
question that I've got for you, which is something that I think I'm going to ask a lot of people because I'm very interested about different people's different perspectives. Do you fear death, and why or why not?
That's a great question. Um, I don't fear anything about being physically dead at all. I mean, I think it's going to be so, like I said, like I was just getting at, so superior to the trenches of this life with the evil and the struggle, and even the personal struggle and the personal fight against our fallen nature and all of that. So it's like, in many ways, I can't wait. But I mean, like, depending on how I die, I'm not looking forward to it. Like, I don't want, like, let's say that I'm hung or burned or if I drown or get struck by lightning, like, I'm not looking forward to that particular way of passing on.
But you don't think that you're going to be ensconced in a little tomb of blackness for the rest of your life, and like what people generally fear when they think of death?
What's the tomb of blackness?
Well, I mean, there's a very famous Alan Watts speech where he talks about death, and he says that death is just something that happens, that you close your eyes. It's like you go to sleep at nighttime, but you just never wake up. But people generally have this fear of the fact that they're going to be ensconced within their little coffin, this little tomb of blackness where they're just trapped with themselves forever. And I found that very interesting to think about. And that's when people are fearful of. I think that fear of death is the reason why I asked this question. I think that fear of death is responsible for lots of ills of the world, because people are
Hmm.
very attached to their worldly possessions, and people are very attached to this life, and um, it breeds a quite a lot of selfishness. And I always find that individuals who don't fear death as much are not as inclined towards those acts. But that's something that we won't get into into the essence of it. But um, I guess that's the sort of what I'm asking you at the end of the day is, uh, what what do you think death is? Do you fear that? Do you fear losing the worldly possessions, your house, your worldly connection with your family, and all of those sorts of things?
No, there's a great quote. I hope I don't botch this right now. He is no fool who loses what he can't keep to gain what he can't lose. That's by Jim Elliot, who's a Christian missionary. And that basically summarizes how I feel about it.
Can you
Meaning,
those
yeah,
can you just do that one more time for me?
he's no fool who loses, or I think he actually says who gives, which is he's talking about your life, like
Mm,
your physical, temporary, 80-year long life. He's
mm.
no fool who gives or ends up losing what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And what he's talking about is like a life lived for God, a life lived for eternity is a life that he's saying it's not foolish because no matter how you slice it, you've only got 80 years. But if everything that I believe is true, I mean, picture a rope and picture at the very end of the rope is like a red piece of tape roughly this long, and picture that rope extends eternally in that direction. Why would I invest and live and do everything for this? Why would I not live in light of eternity? And so that's how I view it is I want even this conversation just makes me so happy because it's like I don't know what kind of random person might hear this and might be like, maybe God isn't the worst. Maybe, who knows? Or maybe they're like, I was right, they're all crazy. But no matter how you slice it, that perspective, that's really the perspective that I have. We are eternal creatures, and I am living for eternity, and death is a doorway. And I don't want to waste a day in selfishness or conceit. I want to live my life like I really believe that, like I'm really going to be with him forever. This is like boot camp, baby. Like, let's go. We only got 80 years.
That's
Let's do
beautiful,
something.
man. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Brandon Maguire, thank you so much for having me. Your documentary is Mining for God. I think you need to promote that a little bit more. Just a bit of advice. I don't know if you want to take that, but if I were you, I'd be shamelessly promoting that on every single video you make, having some sort of something at the end or in the bio or whatever, because I think as many people need to see Mining for God as possible. Atheist, religious, Christian, Muslim, whatever. It's just an interesting documentary. So where can people find you?
I was going to say on that note, if we're promoting that documentary, the easiest way to get to it is if you go to my YouTube channel, which I'm assuming is linked in this video, and then on the banner, it's the link right there on the banner. It'll say like my documentary film or whatever. You click on that link, it takes you to Vimeo. It's there.
Fantastic. And we'll have the link in the bio and in the comments and everything as well. So thank you so much for joining me.
Awesome. This has been so cool.